in which Guido Pialli will defend the academic thesis Essays on Technological Change and Income Distribution. May I invite you to present the summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis. The floor is yours.
Dear Proctor, may I share my screen?
Yes, you may, of course.
May you see?
Yep.
Okay. So, dear Proctor, dear members of the Corona, dear family, friends, and audience, in the next 50 minutes, I will present the summary and the conclusions of my PhD dissertation, entitled Essays on Technological Change and Income Distribution. So there is much evidence over the last several decades of an increase in income inequality, driven by the decline in the labor share of income and the rise in personal wage inequality. The economics literature has much focused on the role of technological change behind the increase in income inequality. This thesis adds to this debate by analyzing the relationship between technological change and both functional and personal income distributions. The current literature is mostly based on the skill bias technological change hypothesis and the evidence of a capital bias direction of technological change. So according to this view, basically a high level of skills are necessary to operate with the capital-intensive technologies. So this thesis challenges and extends this current view along 3 dimensions. First of all, in my first contribution, I start to say that the skill bias technological change hypothesis basically does not clarify whether the skill bias direction is either capital or labor intensive. In my first contribution, I showed that technological change may be knowledge and labor biased, while in the standard economics literature, since the seminal contribution of Grillikes, the skill bias direction was associated with necessarily a capital bias direction. Therefore, in my first contribution, I document a positive relationship between the labor share and technological change that highlights a knowledge and labor bias direction of technological change. In the second contribution, I look at the increase in the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor, and I argue that this may represent a source of biased innovation. Finally, in the last chapter, I link the rising demand for knowledge-based service sectors to the increase in wage inequality overall and within high-skilled workers. So now I'm going to discuss in more detail each chapter of my thesis. So in chapter 2, I analyze the direction of technological change across European local labor markets. Basically, I find that there exists a labor bias direction, and this labor bias direction, I explain this labor bias direction with a localized and bottom-up based technological change and the implementation of efficiency wages. So the idea is that the localized and bottom-up technological change exploits the competence of the workforce and valorizes the learning processes possessed by the high-skilled workforce. And then efficiency wages increase the bargaining power of labor and so lead to an increase in the labor share of income. So I used panel data OLS and IB estimation methods for a sample of 171 regions observed at the NUTS2 level for the period 1999-2015. And I find that there exists a positive relationship between technological change and the labor share of income that implies that the direction of technological change is knowledge and labor biased at the European regional level. Chapter 2 focuses on the increase in the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor at the country level. So the evidence of a capital bias direction is mostly based on the use of a CES production function. According to the CES theoretical model, the elasticity of substitution differs from one, but is constant over time. And therefore, the use of a CES production function does not allow to study the relationship between the change in the elasticity of substitution and income distribution. Instead, on the other hand, in this chapter, me and my co-author construct a theoretical model in which the elasticity of substitution is endogenous and represents a biased innovation. So we use data from the Penworth table for 9 countries observed between 1950 and 2017. We use rolling window analysis and the linear least square estimation methods that are never used in this area of research to find that the elasticity of substitution has changed and specifically increased after the end of the 1970s for all the countries analyzed in our sample. And therefore, we conclude that the increase in the elasticity of substitution has strong connection with the evolution of income distribution. In chapter 4, I investigate the consequences of the transition from a manufacturing-based to a knowledge-based service economy on wage inequality. So here, the idea is that knowledge is more scalable in knowledge-based services, and these may induce superstar effects that lead to increasing wage inequality. So basically, according to the superstar economics literature, individuals' remuneration and the size of the market are related, especially in knowledge-intensive sectors in which basically that are characterized by a great scalability of knowledge. From the empirical side, I studied the relationship between the change in 1910 wage ratio, which is a standard measure of wage inequality, and employment rate in knowledge-based services for 200 US cities, basically that correspond to the metropolitan statistical area level, for the census years 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2010. And I extract this data from the ICON source. Basically, I find that there is a positive impact of the employment rate in knowledge-intensive services on wage inequality overall. Then the other novelty of the paper is to show that there exists a positive relationship between the change in knowledge-intensive services and wage inequality within the sample of non-routine cognitive occupations. I explain this fact by arguing that basically workers engaged in non-routine cognitive tasks are more substitutable among them, and therefore slight differences among them have large differences in productivity. So the mechanism here is reinforced, and so it leads to a higher wage inequality within this sample of workers. Therefore, my thesis looks at the relationship between technological change and income inequality, which is a topic, of course, that has a high societal relevance. I did not stress too much policy implications in my thesis, but of course there are several policy implications that are very important for policymakers. Indeed, high levels of income inequality may reduce trust and social capital, produce adverse psychological effects, and increase crime rates, and therefore high levels of income inequality reduce the quality of life. So I think that the findings in my thesis enable to highlight 3 empirical facts that should be taken into account by policymakers in addressing appropriate public policies. First of all, I show that regions characterized by a faster faster rate of technological change are characterized by greater labor share of income. And therefore, a greater labor share of income tends to reduce overall income inequality. So basically, the idea is that the slow growth leads to higher income inequality. And therefore, higher growth reduce overall income inequality through the effect of an increase in the labor share of income. The second chapter looks at the change in the elasticity of substitution, which is a neglected topic of research, but of course, there are very important institutional factors that may affect the substitutability between capital and labor. For example, there is a recent paper by Knobloch and Stockel looks at some institutional factors that may have played a role in the change of the elasticity of substitution over the last several decades. For example, trade liberalization, labor market regulations, and also they find that more socialist countries tend to have low levels of the elasticity of substitution. Finally, the last chapter focuses on the top income inequality debate, and basically the findings of this chapter tend to support the hypothesis that the increase in top income inequality is driven more by knowledge-based market factors, which is the view of, for example, Kaplan and Rao, rather than social norms or managerial power implications. That is the vision mostly carried out by Thomas Piketty. So thank you for your attention. Now I will give back the floor to the prorector.
Thank you very much for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Dr. Robin Cohen, who was the chair of the assessment committee. And Professor Cohen is a professor of microeconomics of technical change at this university. The floor goes to Professor Cohen.
Dear Guido, dear candidate, thank you very much for your presentation, which was brief and to the point. Let me congratulate you first on having completed your thesis. It was a very interesting thing for me to read. I learned quite a lot by reading it, and it was a pleasure to look at this topic from a slightly different angle than people normally do. And it's very nice to see an attempt to disaggregate a little bit this skill bias and where is it and what does it do and who does it affect, in fact. So I very much appreciated that aspect of your thesis. So congratulations on that. But that brings me to my question. And it's the question that's comes out of chapter 2. And there your argument is something like the following. You distinguish between bottom-up and top-down innovations, arguing that bottom-up innovations have two properties. One is that they're driven largely by localized knowledge of workers, and the other is that they tend to be incremental. I'm interested in the first property here, because you discuss, in fact, learning by doing as a source of valuable knowledge for innovation. So workers accumulate a lot of knowledge just by doing their jobs, and that induces them to think of better ways to do their jobs, and etc. Now, your measures come from patent data, but isn't it the case that learning by doing, to a great extent, will be generating tacit knowledge? Now, you see this a lot in the discussions of the literature. We don't know where this progress is coming from. Learning, we're going to call it learning by doing, and it tends to be tacit. So the underlying innovations that you care about, the knowledge underlying these innovations, is tacit to a great extent. Obviously, nothing is 100% one or the other. Uncodified, and that by itself makes any innovation difficult to imitate because it's hard to get at the underlying knowledge. Now, we know that firms don't innovate every innovation. Don't patent every innovation. And firms, in fact, don't like to patent if they can avoid it. So this is a case, it seems to me, where the innovations driven by bottom-up innovations are most likely to be unpatented. If that's true, your measure is patents. So in fact, you're excluding from your analysis the thing that you're trying to analyze. That sounds like a problem.
Okay, thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent, for the compliments and the comments. Yeah, of course, patent data have several limitations. The most important problem is that firms do not patent all the innovations they produce, and of course, the tacit knowledge basically cannot be incorporated in patent data, and of course, even if the level of codified knowledge has increased over time, there still exists a level of tacit knowledge that cannot be in some way codified in knowledge. On the other hand, I also show that my results basically stand if I use different and alternative measures of innovation. For example, I did a robustness check in which I regress the labor share on total factor productivity, which in my case represents a sort of course, that represents the residual to the contribution of factor and labor to the basically economic production. And that I showed that there exists indeed the positive relationship between total factor productivity and the labor share of income. And so in some sense, I show that I can also capture the level of innovation that is not captured by patent data. I don't know if I answered to your question.
If what I said is true, it's using patent data as opposed, for example, to total factor productivity in the main analysis seems unusual. Yeah. So I would have expected the main analysis to be based on total factor productivity and the robustness check on patenting. Can you explain that choice?
Yeah, basically, I wanted to exploit, patent data in order to construct a more appropriate measure of incremental innovations by distinguish between patents that have, highly impact on market value, so through the number of forward citations that I've received. And so basically, I use patent data in order to distinguish between, from one side, the incremental patents, and on the other side, on radical and breakthrough patents. That was my choice for having used patents in the main empirical analysis.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Francesco Quattraro, who was a member of the assessment committee and who is a professor of economics at the Institute of the Università of Torino. So the floor goes to Professor Quattraro.
Okay, thank you. Let me thank you, Guido Pialli, for his presentation. I enjoyed very much his work. I appreciate the effort to stress and to appreciate and to address the interplay between labor market dynamics, structural change, and technological change along the three chapters, the three main chapters of his work. For the time being, I'm going to focus on the second chapter, and then I will have also some more questions if there is time. Chapter 2 concern the impact, the determinants or the drivers of labor share across European regions, right? Since I see that your work is exactly at the intersection between labor economics, structural change, and technological change, I was thinking, I'd like to know Guido Pialli's opinion on that, that maybe there can be some room for connecting this work, the work that is carried out, with some classical contribution like Barnes or Simon Kuznets, which in a sense are not mentioned in his reference list. And I would like first to know Guido Pialli's opinion in that respect, and if there is a reason why these works have not been addressed in this chapter.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the compliments and the comments to my thesis. So, of course, you cite very important works. For example, the work by Kuznets is one of the masterpieces in the technological change, income inequality relationship, and also, of course, the works of Marx as an important impact on this topic. With respect to Kuznets, of course, I did not mention because mainly my work is focused on the relationship between the direction of technological change and basically income inequality, while, of course, the work by Kuznets was more focused on the rate of technological change. But indeed, also in my case, of course, Kuznets enters into this debate because I show that the slow growth is the cause of an increase in income inequality through the reduction in the labor share. Indeed, I show that countries that have a higher level of technological progress have a higher level of labor share, and so they should have, of course, in virtue of the relationship between the labor bias direction and the income inequality, a lower level of income inequality. And so this stands in contrast with the Kuznets view that imply that there exists a negative relationship, a positive relationship indeed between technological change and the level of income inequality in the first stage of his closeness curve. And then, of course, also Marx and very important implications for this analysis. I did not mention the work of Marx, but I did it indirectly by citing the work of Hicks, that basically was a supporter of the induced technological change approach that was mainly based on the contribution of Marx on the role of relative prices in driving the direction of technological change. But indeed, of course, there are very important contributions that I should probably mention in my thesis in this chapter. Thank you very much.
Yes, actually, I always encourage young scholars to study a little bit more, the founding fathers of the discipline. If I have time, just one more question on chapter 2. You ran a number of robustness checks in your chapter. One of them concerned the spatial econometrics estimation. And in that progression, you change one of the regressors, which is an important regressor in your analysis, which is the unemployment rate. You use the employment rate. So my question is, why don't you use directly employment rate also in the main regression? And usually when you do this kind of changes, it is always suggested to show the main regression with the new variable. Okay, just to provide evidence that the results are quite persistent across the two steps. So I assume that the employment rate is 1 minus the unemployment rate, right?
Yeah, basically it's different denominator, of course, because the unemployment rate is divided by the total population.
Okay, not by the
workforce. But yeah, of course, I did also the analysis with the employment rate in the main specification. I did not show the results, but indeed you are correct in saying that, of course, I need to show also the results when the employment rate is used in the place of the unemployment rate. I use the employment rate in the spatial regression analysis because the unemployment rate has some missing data for some regions. And in order to have a balanced panel, I use the employment rate that has not missing values for the period. Thank you very much for the comments.
Okay, thank you very much for your replies.
Thank you. The opposition should be continued by Professor Lebas, who regretfully can't be present, but his questions will be posed later on at the end of the first round by Professor Cohen. We now move on to Professor Dr. Ron Bosma, who was a member of the assessment committee too, and who is a professor in regional economics at the Utrecht University. The floor goes to Professor Bosma.
Thank you, Projector, and thanks for giving the opportunity to participate in this defense. Dear Guido, first let me congratulate you with a fine thesis. I really enjoyed reading it, so I share the optimism of my colleagues. I think it's a good piece of work with interesting findings. So well done. But here we are not to discuss, to praise you only, but also to go into discussion. So I would like to, I might have a few questions about chapter 4, if time allows. Let me start with the first question. What you do in chapter 4, I think it's a very interesting topic, right? So you look at to what extent there is an increase of share of knowledge-intensive services industries in a city, and to what extent that might have an effect on wage inequality within those cities, and especially within the category of non-routine cognitive workers. So you produce really interesting findings, finding a positive relationship between the two. So that I think is a very interesting observation. your whole line of argument is really based on a mechanism, explaining the mechanisms referring to a superstar economics, which really builds a lot on non-substitutability. It's always a difficult word to pronounce, and the scalability of sectors, right? So due to ICT, certain service sectors might be scalable, and therefore you might find this effect that a larger market share might be beneficial for some people working in that sector, but not for others, and that's why it might have a positive effect on wage inequality. So that's your main line of argument. But if I look at the way you do the analysis, you put all the knowledge intensive sectors, you put them in one category. And if I look at the different services sector that you include in your analysis, right, like communication, finance, but also professional and related services, I expect that scalability between those sectors might differ a lot. Between those, and that might have an effect on your results. So I was wondering, why didn't you explore, let's say the heterogeneity within the service sector in order to actually control for that, and to see to what extent what type of sector is actually driving your result? I expect that finance is really doing the job. So why didn't you explore that a bit more into detail? Thank you.
So, highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the compliments and the comments to my thesis. Yeah, of course, the heterogeneity between all these sectors should be analyzed to see if there are sectors that contributes the more to the overall level of wage inequality. I did a Russell check in which basically I leave one macro sector out once at a time, and the results, I did not show this test, but the results do not change. But of course, I expect that this mechanism should be greater for especially the finance sector and the communication sector, which are mainly the sectors in which this mechanism work out. Yes, but of course, it would be indeed very interesting to try to analyze only, for example, finance and only the communication sector to see if, of course, the results change in terms of, especially in the magnitude of the coefficient. And yes, thank you very much for.
Yeah, because especially you show that your results might be driven by the larger cities, right? So at least you show that when looking at the population density of cities, that the big cities are probably driving the main results, and there I expect that finance, indeed, the share of finance is higher in the bigger cities, so I think it would be really interesting to explore that a bit more into detail, what's really going on and what is driving your results.
Yeah, of course. And I mean, with respect to this, that's why I run the regression by waiting for the city population. That's why, because of course I control for the heteroscedasticity in the residuals by waiting for the city population, because of course I expect that big cities contribute the more to the process. But indeed, I mean, it's an analysis that I should include. Thank you very much.
Right. Okay. Going further on this chapter 4, I was missing a bit of discussion on institutions and to what extent institutions might have affected your results. Interestingly, when you did your presentation today, you were referring to the notion of social norms, right? And you associate that with Spaghetti. So why didn't you include that into your analysis, right? Because here again, I might expect differences between sectors, but also there might be differences between cities. So if you could reflect on that, and maybe when you're answering that question, you might maybe reflect also a bit, although it would be a bit speculative, to see to what extent you might find the same results in European cities. having a very different institutional context. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I mean, since I focus on the US case, of course, I look at the heterogeneity across cities in the US, but of course, there could be large differences between the US and the Europe. For example, there is a paper by Andres Rodriguez Pose and Ni Li that look exactly at the relationship between technological change and the income inequality for the US and then for the Europe, and they notice that there are large differences in institutions. In my case, of course, institutions factors, I did not include a specific control for that, but they are in some sense reflected by the use of census regions, fixed effects in the main empirical analysis, and also by the fact that I control for city fixed effect by taking the first difference. And moreover, I also did a raster check in which basically I include city per time trend variable that should control for all the rising factors over time that should be correlated with the rise in knowledge services and wage inequality. So in some sense, I indirectly should control for the role of institutions in my analysis. But yeah, of course, it could be also interesting to construct a control in the main empirical analysis to see if there is an effect. Indirectly, basically, I did also a raster check at the state level in which I control for tax policies and tax gain indexes, and yeah, this in some sense should control at least for the part of taxation, and but basically they show that the results are robust to include in these controls.
Exactly.
Thank you very much for your comments.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Bart Verspagen, who is the professor of the macroeconomics of innovation and new technologies at Maastricht University. The floor goes to Professor Verspagen.
Thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector. Dear candidates, I will hold my congratulations until after your defense and move to my question immediately. I want to travel a little bit on the road that was opened by Professor Cohen in his question, which means I'm going to ask you something about chapter 2, where you use patents as an indicator of technological change in European regions. And my question relates to the nature of the innovative process and the way that it connects to, let's say, the productive process, including the process of services. Now, my impression is that these two activities, innovation, invention, part of innovation, on the one hand, and production, employment, and so on the other hand, are to an important extent disconnected in space, which means that innovation and invention can take place in one place, in one region, and then the knowledge that's actually developed by these inventions and innovations is being used in a different region. And of course, if that is the case, if that is an important characteristic of this process, then it doesn't make a great deal of sense to be using patents as an indicator of technological change in the region where these patents are invented or where they are applied for. But that still seems to be the thing that you propose to do in this particular chapter. So I wonder whether you could comment on this. Is this the way that you wanted to use the patent indicator? Then what do you think about this issue of the separation of innovation and production and employment? And of course, can you comment on whether you think that poses any problems for the type of analysis that you have carried out in chapter 2?
Okay, highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the compliments and the comments that you did to my thesis. So yeah, of course, the problem with patent data is that they are usually allocated at the inventor's address, and of course the analysis, the usual assumption in the regional economics literature is that the patent has been developed where the inventor resides. But of course, this poses limitations if the technology, of course, is adopted and basically created elsewhere. Yeah, I think that this important point and that I should address in the analysis. I also think that in some I somewhat try to control for this fact by running a spatial regression analysis in which basically I account for the spatial spillovers across regions. So if this is the case, that basically the invention has been invented in a region but adopted in another regions, the use of the spatial analysis should control for the spillover effects across regions. Yeah, but indeed I should work on this measure of innovation. One of the things that could be done is, for example, to assign patents to a certain technology area and then to construct a measure of innovation by waiting for the share of industry employment in that region, which is a measure that has been used, for example, in some recent papers that in some sense should address more properly this problem that you raised. But yeah, thank you very much for the comment.
Yeah, can I just follow up on the spatial regression argument? Because indeed, this is something that I was thinking about when I read it, and I was thinking, in particular, indeed, you know, is the specification that you adopted there, is that in fact aimed at capturing these kind of spillovers? And in the literature, there exist two main arguments about these spillovers. One is connected to the inventive process itself, where people have looked at whether patent citations take place over relatively short distances versus longer distances. And the other is on productivity spillovers, where people have looked at productivity growth or growth of GDP per capita, living standards in regions, and how they are connected to the regions that surround a particular location. So I wonder, can you comment on which of these particular debates did you have in mind when you did the spatial regressions? And most importantly, how is that actually reflected in the specification of your spatial model? Because that's not so clear to me how these arguments, on the one hand, you know, how they would lead to the particular specification of the spatial model that you have adopted.
Yeah, basically, the spatial spillover analysis basically starts from a general spatial Darwin model that generates, of course, a spatial lag for all the regressor of interest. I include some controls, of course, for the population density, for the unemployment rate, and so basically I account for the spatial lag of these variables, and so I account also for the productivity spillover effects across regions. That, of course, indeed seem to have played a role also, as I mean, the spatial spillover coefficient seems to show. But indeed, what I'm interested in is more on the effects of the technological change on the labor share. And yeah, I think I am reassured by the fact that accounting for spatial spillovers across regions does not affect the main results. But yes, indeed, thank you very much for the comments.
Yep, thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Tanja Treibig. She's an associate professor of economics at this university. The floor goes to Dr. Treibig.
Thank you. I also want to congratulate the candidate for a very nice thesis, very coherent across the chapters, though each chapter provides a different view on the problem, but the introduction allows to really provide a guiding framework for the rest of the thesis and combining the different topics together. Given the questions asked so far, maybe you can guess that I will cover chapter 3. So chapter 3 is a bit different because it's a bit more focused on a specific question in the literature, which is on the stability and value of the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor. And of course, it has implications for the overall discussion on the type of bias for technological change, but it's a bit indeed more specific. So my questions are going to be a bit more on the empirical side, because so that's how the literature focuses on this debate. So first, there's this question of the use of the CES production function. So there are a lot of assumptions in this literature, right, on first the functional form, but also what it implies for the elasticity itself, so its value and its stability over time. And what you try to do first in the theoretical part is to provide a functional form that is a bit more generic, that it doesn't rely only on the CES production function. Though then, if I understand correctly, in the empirical analysis per se, you have to again go more aligned with the CES production function as well, but that's not what my question is about. My question is about the stability, this question of the stability of the parameter that you estimate and the role of heterogeneity across time and across countries. So you use a sample of 9 countries over quite a long period, and then you have different approaches of how to measure the elasticity of substitution. So first, the first method gives one value, then you have a value over 1, but then you use this rolling window analysis where you show that there is also instability over time. In particular, from the results, we see that the values not only increase over time, but for some countries, they are also nonlinear, which is quite interesting, but not really discussed. And it's also, I have to say, a bit difficult to understand from this figure where you have all the estimations of the rolling window analysis, because you've showed the parameter P instead of showing the elasticity itself. And then you follow with the second part where you have this distinction between 2 subperiods. So my question is more generally, I accept the fact that from your results, you can indeed say that the elasticity of substitution is not stable. So that's the first result. But I'd like to push you a bit more to explain the diversity across countries that you find, and in particular, whether you think that there's something to be explained in differing countries where the relationship is nonlinear versus linear, and why in your discussion you focus on the linear message, which is it increased over time, which also explains why in the second part you only have these 2 periods and you're not testing this nonlinearity. So can you maybe elaborate on your process of choosing these different methods and how the results of the rolling window analysis can be better explained and aligned with the rest of the results? Thank you.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the compliments and the comments. And of course, I mean, the rolling window analysis, the fact is that does not allow to construct a dynamic path for the elasticity of substitution. I mean, the analysis is not aimed to basically build a dynamic path for the elasticity of substitution, but only to highlight its stability or not over time. So indeed, in that case, also the fact is that we have, of course, less observation than usual industry and firm level data. So of course, we work with a maximum of 70 observations for each country, and therefore the coefficient have not to be considered like the true value that the elasticity has been assumed in that particular year, but only the fact that during that time span, the elasticity was at that value. But this does not mean that there is indeed a path in the elasticity of substitution. So yeah, of course, we should stress more the differences between across countries in the analysis. But yeah, I mean, the main result from those graphs is to show that there is indeed an increase in the elasticity and a non-stability, especially of the parameter over time. And so this, of course, goes against the assumption basically assumed by the CES theoretical analysis that assumes a constant elasticity over a long period of time. And therefore, in the second part of the chapter and the second part of the analysis, we disentangle like the two different periods because we take the 1979 because basically it's the time in which the empirical literature found that the labor share started to decline, and so we basically take that threshold and we look at the first sub-period and then the second sub-period, and we see that there is indeed a difference over time. Of course, it would be very nice also in a further extension of this research to try to disentangle the factors that are behind the dynamics of the elasticity of substitution. But of course, we should need a dynamic framework to analyze indeed what is the value assumed by the elasticity over time. That I don't know for now any paper that try to construct a dynamic path for the elasticity of substitution in which basically we can comment on the differences between and across countries. But indeed, that's a very important comment. Thank you very much.
Yeah, if I have just one more question, more on the estimation per se. So on this first sub-period, you show, so there are not so many descriptive statistics over time, so it's not so easy, but from figure 3.1, we see that for some countries, the capital share is very stable. I mean, or is it because there's no data, or it's super stable for the first periods?
Yeah, that's the main limitation of the Penware table data that applies to all the data for the factor shares used before the 1970s. I mean, for that period, they basically assume that capital and labor shares are constant. That's why we excluded from the sample a lot of countries, because they have like a stable pattern of the capital and the labor share until 1980 and 1990s. Therefore, we try to collect only those countries in which we can see a sort of differences in the capital share even the period before. Because I mean, the Penware table data are constructed based on estimate, on interpolation, and then basically they assume that there was a constancy in the factor shares in some countries before that period, because there are not data.
Still, you had this pattern for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the countries for the first sub-period. So does it mean that the estimates for the first sub-period are less precise, you think, than the second sub-period?
Yeah, I think that could be an issue for our analysis, but yeah, probably those data could also reflect some real trend data that I mean, these countries may have like a stable pattern of the factor shares. I mean, indeed, the empirical literature shows that there is indeed a change in the labor shares dynamics and the capital share dynamics exactly at the end of 1970s, the beginning of 1980s. But indeed, of course, there is a data limitation, and of course, it could be very interesting to rerun the analysis on much more precise data, for example, on France. But for example, if you look at the other countries, for example, the US, in which we have a more dynamic path for the factor shares, the results are even more consistent with our theoretical framework that indeed the elasticity has increased a lot in the last 70 years. So in some sense, of course, for those countries, the process is underestimated.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. The opposition will be continued once again by Professor Cohen, but his observations now will be based on the comments of Professor Lebas, whom, as I said, regretfully can't be present. So the floor goes to Professor Cohen once again.
Thank you, Pro-Rector. The comments of Professor Lebas are actually connected with some of the discussion that's gone on already, particularly the issues raised by Professor Bosma and to a certain extent by Professor Verspagen. So let me read what he has written and then editorialize a little bit and ask you to respond. What he says is the following. This is about chapter 4. I see very well the analytical interest to consider the new nature of the modern economies as now being service-based. The efforts made by the candidate to account for the consequences of the relationship between technological change and personal income distribution are fruitful. Nevertheless, the modern economy is also finance-based, the so-called financialization. And this directly affects the revenues of creative workers. So the impacts of the consistence and persistence of income inequality fueled by the development, disconnected from the real sphere of financial markets, would have deserved to be reported, even if this is outside the scope of the research. So now my editorialization on that comment, I don't think it is outside of the scope of the research for reasons raised by Professor Bosma. The financial services sector is different in many ways from other sectors. It's grown dramatically over the period that you have been studying, and was intimately involved in the crisis, which falls in the middle of your period. That was in fact a financial crisis, not a service sector's crisis. And that relates to some of the things that you did in chapter 2 as well. So it is a big sector in its own right in the services sector. It also is, what do we say, a sector that serves other sectors in the service, particularly in the services sector, and affects the way the service sector, the rest of the service sector operates. And in particular, and this is connected to what Dr. Verspagen was saying, it has facilitated the markets for technology. It's intimately involved in the growing ability of people to buy and sell technology per se, thinking about the work of Gambardella and Aurora. So by lumping them all together and not making these distinctions and not pushing a little harder on the details inside that, haven't you missed some of the very important features going on when you lump all of the things together, as Ron said, in just as the service sector? And this is a very much more specific version of Professor Bosma's question. So your comments on that?
Yeah. Thank you very much, highly esteemed opponent, for the comments. Yeah, basically, of course, that's analysis that should be carried out. Try to disentangle the finance sector from the other services sectors. The fact is that I also did a robustness check in which basically I exclude the finance sector, and the results do not change too much. But indeed, there could be like the same mechanism in play also with the finance sector, is that of course the market size of the finance sector has increased, and therefore, since in this type of knowledge services, market size and individuals' remuneration are linked. Therefore, this creates wage inequality between the top individuals and the rest of the wage and the skill distribution. Yeah, of course, the finance sector is more specific because, of course, there could be other reasons, of course, because of the increase behind the increase of the real wage. Of course, social norms, indeed, in this case, could play a role. So yeah, of course, I'm planning to make also a section in which basically I'm trying to disentangle between the different service sectors, if indeed to see if there are differences. And yeah, of course, especially focusing on the finance service-based sector.
If I may,
yeah,
I think part of the point is, I appreciate very much the fact that you've done robustness checks and try and make sure you're not being driven by various artifacts. But I think part of the point is, Professor Bosman didn't say this, but I think this is underlying a lot of his concern, is simply by removing the finance income from the data, you don't remove the finance sector, because it's everywhere and it's embedded in all the other sectors as an activity. So all you do is remove its output from the sector. You don't remove its impact in the economy, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, of course, there be, of course, a sort of spillover effect of the finance sector, but indeed, I think this could be part also of the mechanism. That could affect the increase in the scalability of the knowledge in all the service sectors. So yeah, of course, other than robustness check, I could also stress in much more detail what are the specific characteristics of the finance sector, and to try to, I mean, advance this process of servitization and income inequality. Yeah, of course. Thank you very much for the comments.
Thank you. This concludes the first round, and I'm happy to give the floor to Professor Quattraro once again in the second round. So the floor goes to Professor Quattraro.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I will add some more comments on to the previous ones. Now I will change a little bit focus. I will move from the chapter 2. I was focusing before to chapter 4, which I appreciated, but I have a couple of comments. First of all, you mentioned that you focus your analysis on 201 cities, right, in Iran. We don't know which these cities are, and maybe this is an information that could be interesting to the reader to appreciate actually the results of your analysis. And also from the economic geography point of view, it is important to know where these cities are, if these are in the northeast or the northwest, in the Midwest. So the spatial distribution of the spatial location of these cities is very much important. Also, I see that since you have this is a sample of cities in United States are metropolitan areas, right? So maybe you don't have any control or robustness check for spillovers or that goes beyond the metropolitan level. So maybe I was wondering whether you have thought about adding some regressors that are measured at a geographical level that is larger than the metropolitan areas. I don't know, New York, maybe something coming from some variables measured at the level of the state of New York. Okay, so and just by way of example, okay. So this, in a sense, can provide you a measure of spatial dynamics, even if you don't check directly for these spillovers. And another issue that you haven't checked in this work, but I think that this work paves the way to a future extension, is the study of the movement, the mobility of cities across the distribution of the inequality measure. So it would be important to see in a future study, you can put everything in the single paper. It would be important to see if cities have changed their ranking in terms of inequality, the inequality index, and if there is any change in this ranking, which is the driver of if the position of a city is improved or worsened, which are the drivers of these changes. Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for the comments. Yeah, of course. First of all, I should report the cities that I've included in the analysis that I'm missing part in my empirical analysis. I run a robustness check in which basically I study the relationship at the state level, so other than the city level, to see exactly if there could be differences in the level of aggregation. Indeed, the city level and the metropolitan statistical areas level does not allow to cover all the US, but only a part. I run the regressions by using the state dimension, and the results basically are the same. And yes, of course, the differences across regions, of course, and across cities are very important. In that part of the literature, of course, is more connected to the differences and the relationship between technological change and between regions level of income inequality. Of course, Andres Rodriguez-Pose has a lot of works on that, and yeah, of course, it could be a very nice extension of this relationship to see if there are differences in the level of income inequality across cities and not within cities, which is my my aim in the empirical analysis.
Thank you. As we still have a little bit of time, I'm happy to give the floor once again to Professor Bosma if he would have a short question or observation that he would think worthwhile to mention.
I was just thinking about one question during the defense, which I did not really prepare, but I was just wondering about, okay, there's a lot of debate now on technological change and how it might not only replace jobs or how they are referred to as jobs on the thread, right? But especially the nature of the job will change, right? So and the type of task that we are going to perform in the future, and some tasks might be automated, some tasks, and so the nature of the job might also change. To what extent did you really consider that, to take that into account in your PhD thesis? This is a big question, but there's a lot of attention on that, on this particular issue, also in the economic geography literature. So maybe you could reflect a bit on that big question while referring to your own thesis. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much, very esteemed opponent, for the comment. Yes, of course, the change over time and the job task is a topic that received now attention, especially in the last.
You may shortly conclude your response. Please go ahead.
Okay, but yeah, of course, that's going to be for sure. There could be space for this analysis in the future. Yeah, thank you very much for the comment.
Thank you. Guido Pialli, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return.
meeting is being recorded.
There we are, back again, yes, including, of course, most importantly, Guido Pialli. Thank you. Guido Pialli, the degree committee here present online has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Monen is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I invite your supervisor, Professor Monen, to now take the floor. Later on, Professor Antonelli will do the laudatio. The floor goes to Professor Monen.
Guido, do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times? To be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I do.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon you, Guido Pialli, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisor, affixed with the official seal of the university shown by the beadle.
As you can see, that's the official degree which you will receive soon.
Thank you very much.
I'm happy to give the floor to Professor Antonelli for the laudatio. The floor goes to Professor Antonelli.
Well, I'm pleased to receive this assignment, so to say. Laudatio is a Latin word, and indeed, Guido Pialli deserves a laudatio for many reasons. First, I'm personally very pleased that he has been able to perform and achieve this twin PhD process. I'm very pleased that Guido has been able to receive a highly qualified training, both by the University of Torino and the University of Maastricht. I'm very pleased that Guido had the chance and the opportunity to work with Pierre Monen, whom I met first, I think, some 40, maybe even 45 years ago in Cambridge. The chance to work with the person who has been himself working with David Grillikas is very important in our profession. And I'm sure that Guido will be able to impinge upon, to build, to go forward with excellent foundations. His defense has shown a solid scholar, able to cope with challenging questions and to acknowledge the opportunities for improvement and yet to so to say, to be able to stand on the results of his own preliminary research. I think this attitude is absolutely positive. Resilience and yet ability to move on and to take advantage of comments and criticism. I think this is a virtue of a scholar which Guido Pialli, on which Guido Pialli can rely. I think that's the best I can tell. Let me explore, so to say, a scientific detail. As I said before to the committee, to the Corona, I want to say in this laudatio that chapter 3 of his thesis is quite an important contribution. The variance of the elasticity of substitution is indeed the evidence that he has produced upon the variance of the elasticity of substitution is a real achievement. Is such a large literature that uses the CIS approach could never come to terms with the variance of the elasticity of substitution. So this piece of analysis warrants further investigations, further efforts, maybe further evidence, not only at the country level, but also at the industry level. And it's an area which deserves much work and has been somewhat disregarded by the literature. I think that's enough for a laudatio, a thesis which contains a piece of real progress. I thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Professor Antonelli. Dear Dr. Pialli, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you, your company, and your supervisors with the degree you have acquired, with a thank you for the contribution of the degree committee, and would like to give them the opportunity to congratulate you, and then afterwards I will declare the ceremony to be ended. So those of you who would like the opportunity online to congratulate Dr. Pialli, please do so.
Congratulations, Guido. It was a pleasure. I wish you all the best in the future.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations also on my side. I know that you will have, for sure, a bright future in the academia.
Thank you very much.
Congratulations, Guido.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Congratulations, Guido. Was already a joy to see you last week and have some chats with you. Then you predicted that you would be nervous, didn't show during the defense, or at least did not block you. So well done, congratulations, and a very good thesis. And good luck with your new job.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, congratulations. Well done.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, congratulations. And I'm also happy I got to see you at the very, very end of your thesis nonetheless. But yeah, maybe see you again in Maastricht another time.
Sure. Thank you very much.
Well, dear Dr. Pialli, it was a pleasure to see you defend your thesis and your research. I hereby declare this ceremony to be ended.